Hey, it's Tom Michael, General Manager here at Boise State Public Radio. Right now, public media is under threat. The White House has asked Congress to take back funding already approved for the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, funding that sustains Boise State Public Radio and NPR stations like ours across the country. We stand to lose over $500,000 annually, jeopardizing our newsroom, programming, and mission. You can help. Learn how to take action at boisestatepublicradio.org/funding.
From the studios of Boise State Public Radio News, I'm Gemma Gaudette. This is Idaho Matters. Hunted to the edge of extinction, wolves nearly vanished from the Yellowstone ranges 70 years ago. But in 1995, the federal government launched one of its most successful and controversial wildlife experiments, reintroducing wolves to the Rockies and igniting a debate that divides the American West. Now, on one side are the pro-wolfers, environmentalists, and indigenous tribes united in the effort of reviving the species. On the other side, ranchers who see wolves as threats to their livestock and livelihood. And that opposition is gaining ground, putting wolves in trouble once again. In their new podcast series, Howl, host Heath Drusen and Idaho Sun reporter Clark Corbin journeyed deep into the predator's territory. They traced the remarkable comeback and the battle between protection and extinction that persists even 30 years after the reintroduction project began. We're lucky enough to have Heath and Clark joining us to talk more about what they found in wolf country. Nice to have you both on the program.
Hey, Gemma.
Hey, Gemma. Good to be here.
It's good to have both of you with us. So, Heath, let me begin with you. Before we get into what you found in your adventures, what inspired you to tell this story?
So, I've always been pretty interested in wildlife, and I do a lot of outdoor stuff. Clark and I both do a lot of backpacking, things like that. And I had a kind of particular encounter in Yellowstone a few years ago where I was hiking by myself, and I actually ran into a wolf on the trail. It was a mama wolf with 3 pups, and we kind of had a moment. We looked at each other. It was a pretty unusual experience, a very lucky experience. And then when she kind of padded off and disappeared, she linked up with her pack, and they all started howling. And it was just eerie and cool, and it was sort of one of the wildest experience I've had in the wild. And it really kind of just made me think more about wow, a few years ago, this couldn't have happened. Wolves weren't here. And it kind of set me on this journey to learn more about wolves and to learn more about the history, and just kind of went down this rabbit hole where the more you sort of peel back about the history of wolves, the more there is that you just didn't know. You realize that there's just so much more to the story.
So, Clark, take us into the reporting process. Where did you go for these stories?
Yeah, thanks, Gemma. Heath and I have spent almost a year and a half at this point writing and reporting Howl. And we were lucky with support from both Boise State Public Radio and the Idaho Capital Sun. We were able to go on this wild 1,000-mile road trip last summer, where we went to some of the last wild places in the West. We went deep into the Yellowstone backcountry with some of the people that originally were involved with the wolf program in Yellowstone. And then we went deep into the Frank Church River of No Return wilderness in Idaho with a guy named Carter Niemeyer, one of the original government trappers who traveled up to Canada 30 years ago and captured and brought wolves back to Idaho by hand. And so we were able to get deep in the field, and that was one of the most appealing parts of this project. It's a long-form written series in the Idaho Capital Sun and a 5-part podcast season, but being able to go deep into the wolf's home with some of the original people that were involved with reintroduction was really one of the most appealing parts of this project for me anyways, Gemma.
So in the podcast, you two take a really deep dive into the history of wolf reintroduction. So I want to go all the way back to the 1940s, where wolves were basically eradicated from the American West. So Heath, why were they hunted so aggressively back in the 40s?
Well, so when settlers came west, and in Idaho, it was pretty late in American history. I think the first town in Idaho, if I remember, was at 1860. A lot of the folks coming out here were bringing livestock with them. They were coming out to be ranchers, to raise cattle and sheep primarily. And it won't be a surprise to listeners, wolves and livestock do not always mix well. Obviously, wolves in the wild eat elk and deer, but as one rancher put it, paraphrasing a little, if they're presented with the choice between a fast, smart elk or a slow, dumb cow, well, the cow's the easier meal. So basically, they were exterminated to protect livestock. The settlers coming west wanted to protect their livestock, so they embarked on a very extensive and very successful campaign to get rid of wolves. Some of it was hunting, some of it was trapping, but a big thing they did was there was a lot of poison put out on the land. So you'd poison hunks of meat, and whole packs of wolves would go eat it and die, and that did the trick. Wolves were essentially eradicated from the West, as you said, in the 40s. Now I know some folks will shoot back like, well, there were always some wolves around, and that is true. That is very true. You'd get lone wolves from time to time in places like the Frank Church River of No Return Wilderness, and then you had some wolves hanging out on the Canadian-Montana border. So they were never 100% gone, but for all intents and purposes, they were extinct in the West. They weren't here in any kind of numbers to have an impact on the land by the 40s. Essentially, they were gone, and the government said maybe that was a mistake.
So with that said, Clark, let's fast forward to 1995. The United States government launches its reintroduction program. Now, why did they decide to revive their species? As Heath just said, the government thought, well, maybe there was a mistake made by trying to eradicate the majority of these wolves.
Yeah, for sure. And 1995 is when the wolves were brought back to Idaho and Yellowstone. That's 30 years ago. That's one of the anniversaries that we're tracing with Howl. But in terms of why they were brought back, you really have to go farther back than that. You can look at the Endangered Species Act, which was signed in 1973. The gray wolf was one of the very first animals added to the Endangered Species Act. And that kind of paved the way for reintroduction. When an animal was added to the endangered species list, then all of a sudden it receives these protections. There's a focus on reviving or restoring the species. And so that laid the groundwork, but it was really a public outcry. There were people all over the country that were involved and were invested and were calling for wolves to be restored at the same time that farmers and ranchers in Idaho, Wyoming, and Montana were pushing back and saying, the wolves are gone, let's leave them that way. So it was a combination of being listed under the Endangered Species Act in the 1970s and public pressure and public support. And then in 1995 is when it actually happened, when a small team of biologists and trappers went up to Canada and captured wolves, sedated them, darted them from helicopters, and then transported them back to Idaho and Yellowstone to reestablish the first wild wolf populations, essentially, in almost 60, 70 years.
And you sat down, as you mentioned, with Carter Niemeyer, and he's the person who led this project from bringing the wolves from Canada. I want to play a clip from the podcast. Let's take a listen, but just a warning, folks, it is a little bit graphic.
Here's what the plan was. The U.S. had an agreement with our neighbors to the north to capture several dozen wolves. The U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service had contracted with Canadian trappers to catch the animals alive. There was one big problem when Carter arrived. The Canadians hired to help catch the wolves to repopulate the Rockies were killing the animals instead.
The guys were killing them, skinning them, and putting them on stretching boards. And then I got up there and met them, and we had a confrontation. They told me to take my truck and get the hell out of town.
That doesn't sound like a good start. It turns out the Canadians thought they were getting stiffed on their contracts because no one from the U.S. government had come out to collect the wolves. Carter had some trust building to do, so he leaned on his strengths.
I said, I ain't leaving. I'm up here to do this job. And the next thing you know, we're in a wolf skinning contest in a trapper's living room.
This was a competition to see who could skin a wolf the fastest. There might have been some drinking involved. Anyway, Carter won the skinning contest, and by doing so, he won over the Canadians. After that, Carter and his team prepared to fit several so-called Judas wolves with radio transmitters. They were so named because these wolves would unknowingly betray their packs by leading the reintroduction team to them. And that would give the team the opportunity to capture enough animals to start repopulating the western U.S. With that, the helicopter rotor blades started up and the team prepared for their mission. But after all of that drama, Carter almost had to abandon his project before it began.
I froze my toe one of the first days out.
It was black from severe frostbite. Remember, it was getting down to 50 below zero. The team doctor took one look at Carter's toe and ordered him off the project. Said he could lose the toe if he continued. And so, Carter did the only thing he thought reasonable. He ignored medical advice, got new boots, and continued on.
Why'd you keep going?
Because I was up there. I mean, that was what I went up to do, and I did not intend to quit or leave the project till it was done.
He carried on with his blackened toe tucked safely into a new pair of big, puffy moon boots. Carter actually darted the very first wolf that was captured for release. He named it Carter's Hope. But shooting wolves with tranquilizer darts wasn't his main job.
I was mostly mugging. The mugger is the guy that you dump out in snow 20 feet deep and you roll and crawl and drag yourself through this ungodly deep snow. Sometimes we're just the little tops of the pine trees were sticking out because the wolves get darted in there and you can't land.
He was literally dragging the tranquilized wolves through the snow with no snowshoes or even sled to pull them.
Heath, that sounds almost unbelievable. Carter must have some serious stories to tell.
Yeah, honestly, his stories are so wild that if it was anybody else, I'd probably be like, "You're full of it, Carter." But just about everybody we talked to for this podcast knew Carter. Like he's a very well-known guy around the West, and they backed up all his hijinks. So that's Carter really did that.
Wow.
But yeah, he's a character. He's really just this sort of Western mountain man, straight out of Central Casting, of a type that you just don't really meet much anymore.
So one thing that you guys did in the podcast was make listeners feel how tense it was 30 years ago when the U.S. government did put wolves back in Idaho. And you talked to Suzanne Aisha Stone. She was on the team that released those wolves in Idaho. So I want to play a bit more from the Howl podcast.
Suzanne was out with researchers in central Idaho shortly before wolves were scheduled to be reintroduced. Her team was surveying the land they would inhabit, a place where the occasional lone wolf still haunted the woods. The team flew on a small plane to an airstrip in the Frank Church River of No Return wilderness. It's the largest contiguous wilderness in the continental U.S.
When we landed, we got news that someone had seen a wolf or wolves over in a place called Bear Valley, adjacent to the Frank Church River of No Return wilderness area. So we, on our way back, diverted and drove out there. Dr. Fritz was teaching me how to howl for wolves. That's how we used to look for wolves. We were on a Forest Service road out in the backcountry on the National Forest. And I got to my second howl, and we had rifle bullet just zing right over the top of our heads.
Suzanne said she's not sure if the shooters knew there were people around, but to shoot blindly towards a road showed deadly recklessness at best, something more sinister at worst. It wasn't the last time Suzanne and others on the wolf reintroduction team would have their lives threatened, but it didn't stop them. In January 1995, Suzanne's team had the job of meeting the Canadian wolves as they arrived in Idaho. These were the wolves Carter and his crew had captured. Suzanne was waiting for them in the small town of Salmon in central Idaho. Salmon and the surrounding area is ranching country. Suzanne told me members of the reintroduction team got a chilling warning when they arrived in town.
There were even signs in Salmon when we were there of kill all the wolves and all the people who brought them here or bringing them here. There were threats of vigilantes coming together. So we ended up having to have a lot of protection, not only for the wolves, but for ourselves, because our safety was at risk.
After those threats, armed federal agents were assigned to guard Suzanne and her team. And the safest spot they could find for the wolves was the local airport.
It was a hangar that had a tall barbed wire fence around the outside, and we took the wolves into the hangar, and they stayed there overnight.
But there was more. Before the convoy left, Suzanne's team got a pretty alarming intel report.
We were definitely notified that there was going to likely be an ambush on the road going out to where we had to drive them out to, because we couldn't fly them out as we had planned to, because the weather was so bad that they, grounded all the aircraft. So, it was crazy. But then the next morning, the sun came out a bit. We had a convoy of vehicles that drove into the backcountry with these 4 wolves, and we didn't, face down any type of ambush.
So once the wolves found themselves back in the American West, this is when controversy really sparked. So Clark, let's start with the supporters of the reintroduction. Who are they, and what motivates them to bring the wolves back?
Yeah, it wasn't just one or two people. It was all different kinds of people, but we found that it was biologists, it was veterinarians, it was people all across the country. I wasn't there at the time, but we run photos from Yellowstone National Park of demonstrations both for and against the wolves. But there were there were rallies and public meetings, and so it was a diverse group of people that were in favor of bringing wolves back. For sure, wolves are a native species. They existed in the West, in Idaho and Yellowstone, for thousands of years until they were killed off by the government. So it was a diverse group of people that supported wolf reintroduction. And at the same time, there was forces just as adamantly opposing wolf reintroduction. And that was, I think we got at some of the tension and some of the hardened attitudes about wolves and some of the strong feelings. And we talk about in Howl about how some of those meetings ended in screaming matches. We interviewed people on both sides of the debate, both pro-wolf people and trappers and hunters who said their lives have been threatened. People on both sides have said they've been subject to threats. And so I think that, when I was talking with Doug Smith, who ran the wolf program in Yellowstone for almost 30 years, he said that attitudes are even more hardened than they were 30 years ago. People aren't talking to each other, and he doesn't view that as progress at all.
So this week's episode is about how the Nez Perce tribe played a critical role in wolf reintroduction. And Heath, I know you spoke to Nez Perce elder Alan Pinkham, so let's take a listen to this.
What I learned from Alan is that the Nez Perce have a compact with animals and the environment to be good stewards of the natural world. It's called Tamalwit, or the unwritten law. Alan says this guided the Nez Perce for millennia. But this compact was challenged by settlers coming west. When the Lewis and Clark expedition reached Nez Perce territory in 1805, it was likely the first non-native people the tribe had contact with, but they were far from the last.
Our stories tell us what we have to do. But then when a new kind of people came to this continent, they told us otherwise. Don't practice your heathen ways. You've got to be a Christian. You got to be civilized. Well, what is civilization? From what I see, what civilization is, has always been how can you kill people in a most efficient way, in a most rapid way.
The settlers who came were also very efficient at killing wild animals. and wolves were at the top of their list. They didn't want wolves eating their cattle and sheep. The first permanent American settlement in Idaho was established in 1860. And in less than 100 years, wolves were gone. Allen says the loss of any species leaves a void for Nez Perce members. The loss of the wolf, or himine in the Nez Perce language, was especially painful. In traditional Nez Perce beliefs, wolves are leaders of animals, and the Nez Perce felt they could learn a lot from them, including how to hunt.
Well, the wolf, he teaches us certain things. He has a little family group that the wolf sustains. And look at the way they hunt. Rarely do they hunt by themselves. And they know how to interact with other animals, particularly the grizzly bear. So when a grizzly bear and the wolves, they meet, they circle each other because they know they can be harmful to each other. So normally they don't fight. Rarely do they fight. So that's what we learn when we observe animals. How do they sustain themselves?
All of that was lost right around when Alan Pinkham's life began, when humans sent the leader of animals to extinction in Nez Perce territory. And several generations only knew a world without wolves. But then, in 1995, the Nez Perce got an unexpected opportunity to help bring the wolf back.
Okay, so Heath, how did the Nez Perce help with the wolf reintroduction?
Yeah, I was really happy that Clark and I got to tell this particular story because I think it's really one that most people don't know. In 1995, when wolves came back, not surprisingly, the government of Idaho was very against it. That part I think people will know. But what actually happened is, the federal government has limited resources. So when they brought back wolves, they needed a state partner to help monitor them. And that state partner was going to be the state of Idaho. That's the most natural one. Idaho Fish and Game would partner with them to help keep track of wolves. Well, what actually happened is the state government, the legislature, just said no. They basically boycotted the whole process. They refused to pass any kind of wolf plan and said, no, you can have your wolves, federal government, but we don't want anything to do with it. So that left the feds in a bit of a pickle because they needed somebody to work with. And the Nez Perce tribe stepped forward and said, well, hey, if the state won't manage wolves, we'll be the state. So essentially, they acted as a fish and game department, and they do have their own wildlife department. They are a sovereign tribe, so in a way, they were pretty well positioned to do it because they do fisheries, wildlife, all of that stuff on their own in their territory. So they stepped forward and they worked with the feds, and they actually did it for more than a decade. And they did it at a time when wolves went from a handful, a few dozen wolves, to hundreds. The population exploded under their stewardship. And when you talk to experts today about wolves in Idaho, they say it was the Nez Perce role was extremely, extremely important at a time when it wasn't really clear how wolves were going to do.
So 30 years have passed since the federal government launched their reintroduction program. Heath, what is the current status of the wolf population in our region today?
Well, wolves have done really well. They've gone from, I think it was 66 wolves when reintroduction happened to thousands. Now, the official numbers, if you count Arizona and New Mexico, which are kind of separate wolf populations, but a subspecies, then you get over 3,000 wolves across the West, 9 Western states. And those are the official numbers. Now, nobody disputes that wolves have done really well. They have. It's one of the greatest comeback stories. We call it nature's greatest comeback story, and it really has been. But there is some debate, and this is one thing, if you listen to the podcast, I don't want to give too much away, but one of the many surprises, I think, is that we've got some wolf experts who think that wolves might be in more trouble than most people think. And they think that, they think some of those numbers are based on some faulty estimation methods, and that it could be lower than thought. And we kind of get into the details and what that might mean. So I guess the real answer is wolves have done well, but we're not totally sure how they're doing at this moment.
So, Clark, I know that the two of you actually went trekking into the wilderness to try and find wolves. You do not have to give anything away unless you want to tell us if you found any wolves. But with that said, I'm curious about how long you actually spent in the backcountry looking for wolves.
Yeah, for sure. And we did see wolves. We saw wolves in Yellowstone National Park. We went out with a group with a former park ranger and author named Rick McIntyre and a group of dedicated wolf watchers. And we did see a mother wolf and her pups. And I actually wrote a whole episode of the written series that's going to be out next week about the wolf that we saw and about the pack that she's been around. But we basically were able to spend the whole month of July 2024 out in the wild. We went deep into Yellowstone. We went into the Frank Church Wilderness. We visited the Nez Perce Reservation up in Lapwai. And so I was talking to Heath about this, but I think we covered more than 1,000 miles in the car and more than 20 miles backpacking deep into wolf country between the Frank Church and Yellowstone. So it was quite an adventure, and we had a blast. It was hard work, but we got to go to some of the last wild places, Gemma, in the lower 48 with some of the people that brought wolves back to the West. And we really wanted to go on that unique experience to share the story of wolf reintroduction in a unique way with our readers and our listeners through Howl, Gemma.
So, Heath, what major obstacles do conservationists say that they continue to encounter when it comes to protecting the wolves?
The biggest obstacle to wolf recovery is human attitudes. And I'm stealing a line there from Doug Smith, who's one of the foremost wolf experts in the world and the guy who put them back in Yellowstone and ran the wolf program there for almost 3 decades. But, there are natural obstacles, right? We see it right here in Idaho. We're a fast-growing state. We keep building into the wolf's territory, right? That is one thing. Certainly human encroachment on wild places is a threat to wolves as well as a lot of other animals. Certainly, a changing climate is changing the environment where wolves live. But really throughout history, the biggest threat that wolves have faced is human opposition to them being on the landscape. And Clark alluded to this before, but what another surprise for me at least was that when we were talking to wolf experts like Yellowstone's Doug Smith, they were like, we kind of thought attitudes would soften, but they haven't. And people are still in their camps, like really against wolves or doing everything they can to help wolves and not accepting any kind of compromise. And so, that impasse, that standoff, and certainly the environmental politics of states like Idaho, Montana, and Wyoming are not in the wolves' favor. There's been increased hunting, increased trapping. The laws have been relaxed so that really you can hunt wolves in Idaho, at least all year round, and use just about any method short of poison. Now, what that's doing to wolf populations is super controversial, that people don't agree on, but certainly experts worry that it's hurting them.
So along with the podcast and the written pieces that Clark is doing, my understanding is you're also having a panel discussion about the history and the politics of these wolves. And you're going to have some really special guests. This is coming up on June 17th. I've got just under 3 minutes left with the two of you. So can you tell us who will be there? Who will be at this panel discussion?
Yeah, so first of all, it is going to be June 17th at 6:00 in the evening at the Boise State University Special Events Center. And most importantly, it is free. So please come on out. It's free. It's going to be a great discussion. We're going to have Carter Niemeyer, that kind of Western mountain guy, right? Straight out of Central Casting, who went to Canada in 50 below zero weather to get the wolves. And he's got some amazing stories, including delivering animals by cesarean section in the wild. We'll make sure he tells stories like that. Suzanne Aisha Stone will join us as well. She was on the team that released wolves in Idaho. And she does a lot of interesting work right now with ranchers and environmentalists. And then we're going to have Marcy Carter from the Nez Perce tribe, who was one of those critical, unsung scientists who worked with wolves in Idaho when the state boycotted the process. So they're all going to be on a panel, and then Clark and I are going to be there as well. We'll moderate the discussion, and we'll also give you some more backstory about this crazy 1,000-mile journey we did through wolf country and all of the very diverse voices we got to talk about wolves. We spent time, as he said, in the Yellowstone backcountry, but also, on a ranch in Carmen, Idaho, right at sort of wolf ground zero, getting that perspective. And we'll give you all of that.
And Heath, the podcast is available for folks to listen to now, correct?
It's everywhere you get podcasts. Search Howl Podcast Idaho, and you'll definitely get it. And then the idahocapitalsun.com, capital with an A, that's where the written series lives, and they're different. So you should check out both. You'll get a little bit of new stuff from each one.
Well, I want to thank both of you for taking time out of your busy schedules to talk with us. We've been speaking with reporter and producer Heath Drusen and Idaho Sun reporter Clark Corbin, talking about the controversial return of wolves to the American West. And as Heath just mentioned, if you want to hear more, check out their podcast, Howl. You can find it at our website, boisestatepublicradio.org, along with some really great photos of their journey. You can also listen to the podcast wherever you get podcasts. And remember to also check out the Idaho Sun and all of Clark's written reporting on it. This is the Idaho Matters podcast. I'm Gemma Gaudette.
Planet Money helps you understand the economy. We find the people at the center of the story.
Garbage in New York, that was like a controlled substance.
We show you how money influences everything.
Tell me what you like by telling me how you spend your money.
And we dig until we get answers.
I had a bad feeling you were going to bring that up.
Planet Money finds out. All you have to do is listen. The Planet Money podcast from NPR.